On a cold, stormy night, a frail woman stood at the gate of her in-laws' house, holding her 3-year-old son close to her chest. Her name was Lynn. She had no umbrella, no suitcase, and no one standing beside her. Moments earlier, her husband's mother had slammed the door shut, shouting, "You're no longer welcome here. Take your child and go." That night, Lynn became a single mother, not by choice, but by force. Most people in her village whispered behind her back. "She won't survive on her own," they said. "She's too soft, too dependent." They expected her to return with a plea, to beg for mercy, to crumble under pressure. But Lynn didn't. What they didn't know was that behind her silent tears was a woman burning with resolve. A woman who had once sacrificed everything for love, only to be betrayed by those she trusted most. A woman who, in the face of humiliation and loss, chose to fight, not just for herself, but for her son. This is not a story about pity. It's a story of power. Lynn's journey from the lowest point in her life to becoming a respected figure in her community will leave you speechless. How did she go from being homeless to building a support network that transformed the lives of other struggling mothers? How did a weak woman shake the very village that once turned its back on her? Stay with us, because by the end of this video, you'll realize the strongest people are often the ones no one sees coming. Rain poured down in sheets, turning the narrow village roads into rivers of mud. Thunder cracked across the sky, echoing like judgment. Lynn stood at the edge of the gate she had once passed through as a hopeful young bride. Now she stood with nothing but her child, and a plastic bag containing a single change of clothes. Her son Nam, just 3 years old, clung to her soaked Aodai, shivering, his small face buried against her shoulder. She pulled him tighter, trying to shield him from the storm, even as her own body trembled from the cold and from something deeper, heartbreak. A few minutes earlier, her mother-in-law had screamed insults, accusing her of being a burden, of bringing bad luck to the family. Her husband, cold and distant, stood by without saying a word. Not one word. Then the door slammed. Just like that, Lynn was erased. She stared at the house, once her home, now a fortress of rejection. The flickering lights behind the curtains mocked her. No one came to check on her. No one offered shelter. With bare feet squelching through the mud, she walked out onto the road, not knowing where to go. The rain mixed with her tears. She could barely see ahead, but each step forward was a small act of defiance. For a moment, she considered turning back. Knocking again. Begging maybe. But then she looked down at Nam, whose eyes, despite the cold, still held trust. He didn't understand what had just happened, but he believed in her. And suddenly, Lynn felt something shift inside her. The humiliation, the abandonment, all of it turned into fuel. She whispered to herself, voice trembling but firm, "They think I'm weak. They think this is the end. But I'll show them. This is just the beginning." She pulled her scarf tighter around Nam, lifted her chin, and walked into the darkness. No destination, no plan. Just a mother and her child, stepping into the unknown. And in that moment, under the relentless storm, Lynn made a silent vow. No one would decide her fate but her. The next morning, Lynn arrived at a rundown boarding house on the outskirts of the town, a place where the forgotten and struggling found shelter. The air reeked of damp walls and old cooking oil. The mattress was thin, the fan broken, and the room had just one tiny window letting in a sliver of light. But to Lynn, it was a roof. A beginning. She placed Nam on the bed, his tiny body still recovering from the cold night. He coughed in his sleep. Lynn pressed her lips against his forehead, her own eyes red and swollen from lack of sleep. She had no time to rest. By noon, she was out in the streets, asking for any kind of work. Washing dishes, one restaurant owner offered. 20,000 an hour. No rest. Laundry, another said. Bring your own gloves. She took both. Every day, from dawn until past midnight, Lynn scrubbed dishes until her fingers cracked, her nails turned yellow, and her back ached so much she could barely stand. When Nam cried in the middle of the night, she sang softly to calm him, even though she had no voice left. There were moments, in the bathroom of a diner, under flickering fluorescent lights, when she stared into the mirror and saw a stranger. Pale, Sunken cheeks, dark circles, hands covered in detergent burns. "Is this what my life is now?" she whispered to herself. She felt like quitting more times than she could count. But every time she thought of giving up, she imagined Nam growing up in poverty, bullied, told his mother was a failure. That image alone kept her going. And then, one day, while delivering food scraps to a nearby market, she overheard two women talking about a free vocational class offered by a charity group: sewing, cooking, and even computer skills. Lynn hesitated. Could she even learn something new? Could she find time? That night, she sat by the broken window, watching Nam sleep peacefully on the floor. She thought about the months ahead, of all the years she had sacrificed for a man who threw her away. Now it was time to rebuild. She whispered, more to herself than anyone else, "I don't want to just survive. I want a future for my son." The next morning, despite her sore muscles and barely a few hours of sleep, she went to the charity center and signed up. She knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing had been. But for the first time in months, she felt a flicker of something real hope. The decision wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. But it was the first step on a new path, one she was choosing for herself. 6 months passed. The days were long, and the nights longer, but Lynn endured. After every cleaning shift, she would rush to the community center, where a kind volunteer named Ms. Ha taught vocational sewing and basic business skills to women like her, the overlooked, the discarded, the forgotten. At first, Lynn struggled. Her fingers were rough and tired from dishwashing, and she often fought off sleep during class. But she never missed a single session. While others sometimes dropped out due to fatigue or family burdens, Lynn stayed. She stitched every seam with the same quiet determination she had shown that rainy night when she left her old life behind. By the end of the course, Miss Ha took her aside. "You have hands made for creating," she said gently, "and a heart strong enough to go far." That moment, small and private, lit something in Lynn she hadn't felt in a long time: pride. Not long after, Lynn got a part-time job at a small tailor shop in the city. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, cleaner, more stable, and filled with possibility. Her first paycheck wasn't much, but when she brought it home and bought Nam a new pair of shoes, she cried. Not out of sadness, but of quiet triumph. She had done it. And now she smiled more. The lines on her face softened. Her laughter returned, hesitant at first, then brighter each week. Neighbors began noticing. The landlord, who once looked at her with pity, now nodded with respect. But Lynn didn't forget where she came from. She returned to the same community center, not as a student this time, but as a volunteer. She began mentoring other single mothers, women who had been left behind, just as she once was. "I know what it's like to feel worthless," she told them during their first meeting. "But I also know that the only person who gets to decide your worth is you." One of the women, freshly bruised from a broken marriage, broke down in tears. Lynn took her hand, just like Ms. Ha had once taken hers, and whispered, "You're not alone." Word began to spread about Lynn, the quiet woman who used to scrub floors and now stitched dreams. Her group grew. They laughed together, cried together, learned to rise together. And Lynn, once the outcast, had become a quiet force of change. She no longer needed validation from anyone. Her strength was evident in the way she carried herself, in the way her son beamed with pride whenever he looked at her. From a dimly lit boarding room to a thriving support circle, Lynn had become the light she once searched for. It started with just 5 women. They gathered every Sunday afternoon in a small room behind the community center. The walls were bare, the furniture mismatched, and the tea was instant, but the warmth in that space was undeniable. Lynn had named it the Second Sun, because, she said, even after the darkest night, another sun always rises. At first, it was simple. They shared stories of broken homes, sleepless nights, unpaid rent, and empty stomachs. But with every confession came comfort. With every tear, another hand reached out. Slowly, the pain that had isolated them became the very thing that connected them. Lynn taught them what she had learned: how to stitch a hem, where to find free legal aid, how to apply for part-time jobs, and most importantly, how to believe in themselves again. "I'm not a counselor," she would often say with a shy laugh. I just know what it's like to feel invisible. One Sunday, a new member, Mai, showed up. She was young, barely 22, with a baby girl on her hip and no place to stay. The group rallied together, finding her shelter, giving her secondhand baby clothes, and walking with her to job interviews. It wasn't charity. It was sisterhood. Week by week, the second son grew. Women brought their friends, then neighbors. Lynn moved the group to a larger space, a donated classroom at a local school. Local shops began donating supplies. A kind cafe owner offered free space for weekend meetings. Then, one day, a local journalist doing a story on community resilience visited one of the gatherings. She sat quietly, listening to the laughter, the shared stories, the bursts of encouragement that echoed through the room like music. A week later, Lynn's story, and the story of her growing circle of single mothers, was featured in the local newspaper under the headline, "The Woman Who Rebuilt Her Life and Lifted Others with Her." The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from other districts. Donations followed. More single mothers reached out, asking how to join, how to help. The community that began in silence and shame had blossomed into a movement, rooted in compassion and fueled by survival. Lynn watched it all with quiet awe. It wasn't about her anymore. It was about them. The women who refused to be defined by failure. The mothers who learned to stand not just on their own feet, but together. And for the first time in years, Lynn no longer asked herself if she was enough. She felt it. In the smiles. In the tears. In the strength that now lived not just in her, but in every woman who walked through the doors of the second son. It was a quiet afternoon when the past came knocking. Lynn was leading a workshop on financial literacy for new single mothers at the community center. Her hands moved confidently across the whiteboard, her voice calm, her presence grounded, a stark contrast to the frightened woman she once was. But as the session ended and the women trickled out, she noticed two familiar figures standing at the doorway. Her former mother-in-law, dressed in modest silk, clutched her purse nervously. Beside her stood Lynn's ex-husband, Tuan, the same man who once watched silently as she was cast out into the storm. For a moment, the room seemed to freeze. Memories returned like a wave, the rain, the shouting, the door slamming shut. But Lynn stood still, composed. "We heard about what you've done," Tuan began, his voice lower than she remembered. "The group. The articles. Everyone in the village is talking about you." Lynn offered a polite nod, saying nothing. Her mother-in-law stepped forward, a hesitant smile on her lips. "You've changed so much. You're stronger now." "We were wrong, Lynn. We misjudged you. Tuan wants to make things right. Come home. Start again for Nam's sake." The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy, uncertain. Lynn looked at them, these two people who once believed she wouldn't survive a week alone. Now they stood before her, humbled not by guilt, but by the undeniable truth. She had risen without them. There was a time when she would have wept at those words, begged for them even. But now she saw clearly. She smiled gently, but her tone was firm. "I appreciate you coming," she said. "But I already have a home, and a purpose. I'm not the woman who left your gate that night. And I'll never be her again." They left quietly, unable to argue. There was nothing to say. As the door closed behind them, Lynn exhaled, not in relief, but in peace. She hadn't chosen bitterness. She had chosen herself. That evening, as the sun dipped low over the rooftops, Lynn sat on the floor with Nam, helping him with his homework. He looked up suddenly and asked, "Mioi, were you always this strong?" She paused, then kissed the top of his head. "No, Khan. But I became strong because of you." And with that, she rose, laptop in hand, and opened a new document, a proposal to expand the second son to nearby towns. There were more women out there, still in the dark, still alone, and she wasn't done yet. Her past had come back to find her. But she was already far ahead, lighting the way for others to follow. The video clip was only 5 minutes long, a candid interview recorded by a local charity group, where Lynn spoke softly about the night she was forced out of her husband's house, her days scrubbing dishes, and how the second son had grown from 5 women to over 100. She never expected it to go viral. But within days, her story began to ripple far beyond her small town. The video was shared across parenting groups, women's empowerment forums, and even featured on national morning shows. Her quiet strength, her humility, and her unwavering love for her son touched hearts across the country. Messages poured in, not just from single mothers, but from young women, widows, divorcees, even teenage girls. Some sent letters, others sent photos of their own sewing projects, inspired by Lynn's determination. One message simply read, "Because of you, I finally believe I'm not broken. Thank you for showing us we matter." Lynn read every message, often through tears. She hadn't set out to become a symbol. She just wanted to survive. But now, her survival had become someone else's inspiration. And that, to her, made every scar worth it. Soon, invitations began arriving. First, a small seminar on women's rights. Then, a university workshop on rebuilding after domestic hardship. Then a major national forum hosted by a nonprofit that supported rural women's development. Lynn, once terrified to speak even in group settings, now stood on stages before hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people. Her voice, once tremulous, now carried with calm certainty. She didn't wear expensive suits or speak with rehearsed flair. She wore her simple AO dye, brought Nam along when she could, and spoke from the rawness of her truth. "There was a time," she told one audience, "when I thought being abandoned meant I was worthless. But sometimes, being thrown away is what gives you the freedom to become who you're meant to be." The crowd rose in applause. Some wiped tears. Others reached for her hand afterward, just to say thank you. Yet, amid all the attention, Lynn remained unchanged. Fame didn't excite her. It humbled her. Back at the Second Son, she still helped organize food drives, taught sewing to newcomers, and made time to talk privately with mothers who were still learning to believe in themselves. She hung photos of her community not as trophies, but as reminders. This movement wasn't about her. It was about every woman who had ever been told she was too weak, too small, too broken to start over, and proved the world wrong. And each time Lynn stood before a crowd, she carried those women with her. Their pain, their courage, their victories. Hers was no longer just a story. It had become a light, one that would never go out. It was a cool autumn evening when Lynn was invited to speak at a national conference on women's resilience. The room was grand, filled with professionals, students, and community leaders. Cameras were rolling. But Lynn didn't read from a script. She didn't need one. She walked onto the stage with quiet confidence, dressed simply in her pale blue AO dye, her hair tied back neatly. The spotlight was bright, but her eyes didn't flinch. She began with a pause, not for drama, but reflection. "I was once a woman who thought her life ended on a rainy night," she said gently. "I was pushed out, alone, with a child and no direction. But now I see that night wasn't my ending. It was my beginning." The room fell into a hush. No one moved. She spoke slowly, each word carrying the weight of lived truth. "I learned that resilience isn't about being unbreakable. It's about being broken and choosing to rebuild anyway. I cried. I failed. I doubted myself hundreds of times. But I kept going. Not because I was strong, but because I had something worth fighting for." She paused, looking toward the front row where Nam sat, smiling proudly. "I learned that self-worth doesn't come from how others see you. Not from a husband, not from family, not from society. It comes from how you choose to see yourself. And once I stopped waiting for approval, I finally became free." People nodded. Some had tears in their eyes. "And above all," Lynn continued, "I learned the power of love, not the romantic kind. I mean the fierce, quiet love a mother carries. The love that builds communities. The love that saves lives. It saved mine." She smiled gently. "We live in a world that tells women to be quiet, to endure, to shrink. But I say, endure, yes, but don't disappear. If you feel broken, lost, abandoned, please remember, your story isn't over. You still have pages to write." A long silence followed. Then, thunderous applause. Some rose to their feet. Others rushed to meet her afterward, not as fans, but as sisters, drawn to a light that had once been born in the darkest night. That evening, Lynn sat alone with her cup of tea, reflecting. Her journey had started with rejection, but now it was rooted in purpose. She no longer questioned why things had happened the way they did, because now she understood. Her pain gave her strength. Her fall taught her how to rise. And her story, once a private ache, had become a public spark of hope. And that, she thought with a quiet smile, was more than enough.